You're watching Credlin. Well, despite announcing 2 weeks ago that international cruise ships would no longer be allowed to dock at Australian ports, several cruise ships have been allowed to dock and disembark passengers who've brought with them new cases of coronavirus. One of these cruise ships, you'll all remember it now, the Ruby Princess, has had 26 passengers who've now tested positive for coronavirus. As far as stuff-ups goes, this one is monumental. Joining me now is the Australian's New South Wales political correspondent, Yoni Bashan, via Skype. Yoni, thank you very much for your time. You really stepped us through the calamity of events that caused this, I think, great breach of border security. And it looks like it's the fault of the New South Wales Health Department or health officials or health minister or something in that order. But let's start at the beginning. Take us back to last week and this ship arrived in port. How did it even get to the point that it was disembarking passengers?
Well, that's a very good question. If we rewind our minds back to last Friday. Now, last Friday is when we first learned that this ship had docked in Sydney. We learned at about 1 p.m. that there were cases of coronavirus on board. But what we didn't know was that the 2,700 passengers on board the ship had already disembarked the previous day. They had arrived Thursday. And so 2,700 passengers had disembarked from the ships. They had hopped onto shuttle buses and into taxis, and they had gone to airports, and they had dispersed throughout Sydney, but also interstate, and at least 100 of them went to the United States where they were from. And what ensued from that point was a scramble effort by New South Wales health officials to track down every single one of these people, because what the health department had since learned after allowing them to disperse into the community
was that 4 people on board the ship had been diagnosed with coronavirus. So efforts then had to be made to locate each and every one of these people to effectively tell them to stay in quarantine.
But Yoni, the problem is there's now 48 people connected with this ship. They got off in the middle of the night. Now that tells me something in itself, that the ship was allowed to disembark its passengers at, 2:30 in the morning. That looks like a cover-up under the cloak of darkness to me. But also they've gone in, as you say, onto domestic transport, airlines in this country. They've gone all around Australia. We know some of the cases in WA emanate now from this ship. I was speaking to former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who arrived back from Japan yesterday morning. He is now in home quarantine, as he should be, for 2 weeks. But he was saying people were coming off the plane and no one was checking temperatures. No one was doing any great interrogatories of passengers. They had a slip of paper that they all signed to say they'd do the right thing. This seems to me to be very, very porous, both at the port and at the airport.
Absolutely. And I spoke to a gentleman this morning who was aboard the Ruby Princess when it arrived in Sydney on March 19. That was last Thursday. And the report from that man was quite simply that when he and the other passengers were disembarking from the ships, they had their arrival cards in their hand, but there was no screening. There was no temperatures being taken. There was no scanning of baggage. There was effectively no barrier between those individuals and the state of New South Wales. So arrival cards were snatched out of hands and people were just flagged through, and they were able to, as you say, disperse through all manner of transport to where they needed to go. And as you rightly pointed out, this ship arrived at 2:29 a.m. that morning. Now, the explanation I've been given for that arrival, which is unusual. Normally the ships arrive around sunrise, between 5:30 in the morning and 7 in the morning. But the explanation that I was given for the early arrival was the fact that the ship knew that there was a cut-off point emerging for when cruise ships and foreigners would no longer be able to disembark from ships of that kind. And so they made a mad rush to get there on time. It just so happened that there were 4 coronavirus cases on board, though that wasn't known for another 24 hours afterwards.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't buy that. There was a lot of people that were known to the ship's crew and Australian authorities. We knew that they were ill, and right in the middle of a pandemic, you've got to assume the worst. So you mightn't have known it was coronavirus because they had yet to be tested and confirmed. But by God, you know they're sick, you know you should be concerned. Who's taken responsibility? Is it the New South Wales government's fault? And how can we ensure it does not happen again?
Well, firstly, no one has taken responsibility for it. I mean, what we've had is a statement from the New South Wales Health Minister, Brad Hazzard. He spoke on Saturday and he said, I'm paraphrasing his words, of course, but he said it was with some regret that the people on board the ship were not quarantined, that there were not more rigorous quarantine measures that were enforced that day. Because obviously you cannot have additional situations where thousands and thousands of passengers who arrive in Sydney are allowed to simply disperse as they did. And that is indeed what we have seen happen. There are 4 other ships that have since arrived into New South Wales with thousands of passengers and crew on board, and they too have been allowed to disperse. So New South Wales Health has not just been chasing passengers from the Ruby Princess, it's been chasing passengers from the Ovation of the Seas and various other vessels that have been allowed to dock. But to your point...
The Ovation of the Seas, I've got to jump in there. That is one of the largest cruise ships in the world. I think it's like the 7th or 8th largest, and it's got upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 people. This is extraordinary.
It is, and the Ovation of the Seas, as of a few days ago, had 1 confirmed case of COVID-19. We today learned that there are 5 cases of COVID-19 on board, and it's almost certain to rise, that number. So just going back to your point earlier about who should take responsibility for this, it's a very good question. What we know about the way the ports are being managed at the moment during this heightened state of calamity is that New South Wales Health is the lead agency. Now, if we're to mount any criticisms of the way that this cruise ship and the passengers were managed, it's really the fact that the Ruby Princess arrived on March 19, a Thursday. You had a number of people on board the ship who were reporting themselves as being unwell. To what extent, we don't know. All we know is that coronavirus testing...
All right, I think we might have lost him there. I've got to grab, this issue was raised in question time today, and I'll play that for you with my panel after the break, because I think that will explain a whole lot of stuff that I think every Australian needs to understand, particularly as we've got some real challenges.